regardless of who decides. And it doesn't seem to me that these are connected at all. In fact, the notion that we engage in a discussion about, well, might you need certain network management rules, whether community decided or otherwise, in order to ensure that a remote community has access, I don't think it's ever really been put that way. I mean, we've got a problem with getting access into certain communities, and it's not about whether or not you can shape certain kinds of traffic. It's about, for the larger players, there isn't enough of an economic case, and so they don't do it. And at the end of the day, it comes down to decisions either at a community level or at a provincial level or at a federal level to say that universal access to the internet ought to be a right of every single Canadian. And we need to make the investment to ensure that everybody has that access. And acknowledge that even with whatever faith you have in the marketplace, I mean, we had the Telecom Policy Review Panel that did a lot of analysis, and their conclusion was, even under the rosiest scenario of what the marketplace would provide, there'd still be 5% of Canadians that don't have access. Well, you got to decide whether your Canada is good enough that 5% people don't have access. I mean, mine isn't. And I think that it has to be a fundamental choice in this country that everybody gets access, full stop. And that's not a network management issue at all. That's just basically the principle that we've got to be prepared to expend the necessary dollars to make sure it happens.
Bravo. If they want to speed up telehealth, and if they want to speed it, if a northern remote community that runs its own, that controls its own infrastructure, wants to speed up telehealth services, and it's a community-based decision, I think that's, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, I just think that that's something that's fundamentally different than Bell discriminating in an anti-competitive way.
Okay, it's 10 after 8, and there are lots and lots of issues we could explore here. We could be here till midnight, but we have to leave before 9. And somebody's waving at me back there. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm not cutting off questions. I'm just, no. No, but I do want you to start thinking about questions that are going to move us forward, so that we get some maybe kind of political agenda going here, some kind of agenda that people can get behind. So I'll take your question, don't worry, and but I'd like to think about, I'd like you to think about framing your questions or your suggestions in that way. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's me. A lot of people have websites now.
Kudos to you. I like the blog, and
A little louder if you can.
okay, I posted a couple of, I made a couple of posts on there as well. So.
Yeah, hey.
But I think we're on the same wave in terms of access and free speech and stuff like that. And I think one thing came up while I was doing a bit of research, and I haven't really received kind of answers that have been satisfactory to me, and maybe somebody in the audience or on the panel can maybe enlighten me a bit further about the idea of wireless mesh networks. Because I've heard that an entire country was once patched together, like before there was an ISP, and they're all patched together, connected, using mesh networks on laptops or desktops or whatever. What's the deal there? Can we maybe sometimes get away from ISPs and maybe do the peer-to-peer thing using wireless?
Maybe is there someone in the audience?
And that might also be good for rural networks possibly too, but I don't know. I don't know enough about the technology.
Okay, we've got.
Sure. It's Jacob Glick. I'm Canada Policy Counsel for Google. Just one of the things to think about in that context.
Louder. Can you use the mic actually
Sure.
so our online people can hear?
Sure. I'm Jacob Glick. I'm Canada Policy Counsel for Google. One of the things you might think about in that context is spectrum reform. Spectrum reform. So, as you know, recently Industry Canada auctioned off a certain part of the radio spectrum for use in wireless services. A set-aside was made for new entrants, and those new entrants will be rolling out their wireless services soon. That's a good thing. And it raised billions of dollars, $4 billion to be exact. Lots of people have said that that money should go towards broadband infrastructure. I think these days it's probably going to go to the deficit, but that's another story.
Automakers.
Right? Is this thing on? Try the wheel. But there's a part of the radio spectrum that is going to free up soon. And that's the part of the radio spectrum used by over-the-air analog television broadcasters. And that presents a huge opportunity for government and for innovation. Because that spectrum is really, really good spectrum. It goes through walls, it goes far, and there's a possibility of, if you especially allocate that spectrum and allow it for use, for unlicensed use, that is, not the exclusive use of any one person or company, but unlicensed use, like the Wi-Fi spectrum, you may get a significant amount of new entrants and innovation in the delivery of broadband over wireless. Just in the same way that the Wi-Fi spectrum was, in the 1980s, made unlicensed, and it was decades later, or a decade later, that it was used for wireless home networking. So this is what one of our founders calls the potential for Wi-Fi on steroids. So for what it's worth, you may see some facilities-based competition in the context of spectrum reform, although truly you will probably not see the same speeds as you will ultimately see with fiber to the home broadband networks.
I participate in a community wireless group here called Ottawa Gatineau Wi-Fi, and whether it's a mesh network or whether it's a hotspot system, you still need the ISPs. So you don't bypass the ISPs.
What about in the future?
Maybe, but I'm not convinced of that. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, well, I was participating in some field.
Can't hear you.
Sorry. I also participating in some field from Montreal. I also work with Gatineau Wi-Fi. And we've been having work group for mesh network for quite a while. And it's still the same thing. It requires a lot of technical expertise to deploy, a lot of money. And for
It's like anything, though.
yeah, well, for the short future, short span, it's way out of range for most communities to deploy it.
One other person had their hand up. Yes, go ahead.
Are we finished with that topic? If not,
So let's move ahead then. Yes, go ahead. Do you want to talk, do you have some ideas around moving ahead as far as this agenda
I
goes?
think so, and I want to address this
Sure.
to you, Michael. You talked about, when you talked to Senate, you said one of the other things on the agenda was wireless. And there's a couple of obviously links, and we just had one of them in terms of spectrum reform, but the other one is clearly the impact of this infrastructure in terms of our own commercial competitiveness going forward. If we have a role to play in the post-industrial renaissance, or whatever we're going to call it, one of the miracles, I believe, is that RIM has been so successful, given that the community it comes from is probably 10 years behind the curve in terms of many of the markets it deals with in terms of wireless infrastructure.